If you think being a billionaire's son is about spending designer clothes, fast cars, private jets, you've already lost the game. And I don't mean that as an insult. I mean it as a wake-up call. Because here's something the truly wealthy figured out a long time ago, and they've never felt the need to announce it publicly. They don't save money. Not in the way you and I were taught. Think about what saving actually means. You work, you get paid, you put some of that money into a savings account. And at the end of the year, if you're lucky, you earn maybe 4 or 5% interest. Meanwhile, inflation is quietly eating away at your purchasing power. You're not building wealth. You're barely keeping up. But while you're doing that, the billionaires are doing something completely different. They're hiding money, moving money, and multiplying it through systems that most people never learn about because those systems aren't taught in schools. They're not covered in basic personal finance books, and frankly, the people who use them have very little incentive to explain them to the rest of us. Now, let me be clear about something before we go any further. This is not a video about doing anything illegal. Everything we're going to talk about today is completely legal. These are systems that have existed for decades, in some cases, centuries, and they're available, in various forms, to anyone who understands how to use them. The problem isn't access. The problem is knowledge. So here's what we're going to cover today. If I woke up tomorrow with $1 billion inheritance sitting in my account, I would immediately deploy what I call the 3 modern utilities, the foundational systems that separate old money from new money, and new money from people who win the lottery and go broke within 5 years. We're also going to talk about the billionaire mindset around debt, around time, and around risk, because every single one of these will challenge what you currently believe about wealth. Let's get into it. Here's a number I want you to sit with for a moment. In 2021, ProPublica obtained leaked IRS data and published an analysis showing that between 2014 and 2018, Jeff Bezos paid 0 federal income tax in 2 of those years. Warren Buffett, one of the richest men alive, has repeatedly stated that his effective tax rate is lower than his secretary's. Now, before anyone gets outraged, let me explain exactly how this works, because it's not cheating, it's chess. The first thing wealthy families do with large sums of money is move it out of their personal name and into legal structures designed specifically to reduce tax exposure. The most common of these are trusts. A trust is essentially a legal container. You transfer assets, property, stocks, a business, into the trust. The trust owns those assets. You are no longer personally the owner. And because you're not the owner, you're not personally taxed on the income or gains those assets generate in the same way. There are different types of trusts: revocable, irrevocable, dynasty trusts, and they each serve different purposes. But the common thread is this: they separate your personal identity from your wealth, and that separation has enormous tax and legal protection advantages. Now here's where it gets interesting. The wealthiest families in America, the Rockefellers, the Waltons, the Kochs, don't just use trusts for tax purposes. They use dynasty trusts, which can hold assets for multiple generations without triggering estate taxes each time wealth passes from parent to child. Here's the analogy I want you to hold on to. Imagine you have a bucket of water. Every time you hand that bucket to your child, the government takes 40% of the water out. Then when your child hands it to their child, another 40% disappears. A dynasty trust is a pipeline. The water flows continuously, generation to generation, and the government can only tax what leaves the pipeline, not what's flowing through it. Ask yourself this: when was the last time a financial advisor sat you down and explained how trusts work? When did anyone in your life walk you through the difference between a revocable and an irrevocable trust? If the answer is never, that's not an accident. That's a gap in financial education that disproportionately benefits the people who already know this information. Now, if this kind of content is something you want more of, real, factual financial strategy that most channels won't touch, subscribe right now. We break this down every week, and what's coming in the next few chapters is even more important than what we've covered so far. I want to say something that is going to sound completely backwards to most people who grew up being told debt is bad. Billionaires love debt. Not because they're irresponsible, exactly the opposite. Because they understand a concept that changes everything once you grasp it. There is a fundamental difference between debt that buys things that lose value and debt that buys things that make you richer. Poor people, and I use that term not to be harsh but to describe a financial pattern, use debt to buy things that depreciate: a car loan, a personal loan for a vacation, credit card debt for clothing. Every single one of those purchases loses value the moment you make them. And you're paying interest on top of that loss, so you're losing twice. Billionaires use debt to buy assets that appreciate: properties, businesses, equity stakes. And here's the specific strategy, documented and reported extensively, that the ultra-wealthy use and that most people have never heard of. It's called buy, borrow, die. And yes, that is its real name. Here's how it works. Step 1. You buy an appreciating asset. Let's say it's $50 million worth of stock in a company you believe in. Step 2. Instead of selling that stock, which would trigger a capital gains tax event, you go to a bank and you borrow against it. The stock is your collateral. The bank gives you a low-interest loan, often somewhere between 2 and 4%. You now have cash in hand without having sold a single share. Step 3. You use that cash to buy more assets, more property, more equity, more appreciating value. And here's the genius part. The interest you pay on that loan is often tax-deductible. The stock continues to appreciate. You never triggered a capital gains tax event. And when you eventually die, your heirs receive the assets at what's called a stepped-up basis, meaning the original cost of the asset is reset to its current market value, and the decades of capital gains effectively disappear. Elon Musk, Larry Ellison, and Larry Page have all reportedly used loans backed by their own stock holdings rather than selling shares. Bloomberg reported in 2021 that this strategy has allowed some of the wealthiest individuals in the world to access billions in liquidity without triggering meaningful tax events. Now, what's the version of this that regular people can access? It already exists in most people's lives and they don't realize it. A mortgage is debt against an appreciating asset. A business loan is debt used to build cash-flowing infrastructure. The principle is identical, the scale is just different. The question isn't whether you can use debt as a tool. The question is, are you currently using it to buy things that go up in value or things that go down? What would you do differently if you thought about every loan you take through this lens? If this is changing the way you think about money, hit the like button right now. It helps more people find this content, and honestly, this next chapter is one of the most important things I'm going to say today. Here is a statistic from the National Venture Capital Association that most people find deeply uncomfortable. Approximately 90% of venture-backed startups fail. 90%. And yet, venture capital as an industry has produced some of the most extraordinary returns in financial history. The reason is a concept called portfolio thinking. And once you understand it, the way you think about risk will never be the same. Here's the analogy. Imagine you make 10 small bets. Each one costs you $1 million. You fully expect that 7 of them will fail completely. 2 of them might return your money with a modest gain. But one of them, just one, becomes the next Uber, the next Airbnb. And that single investment returns 100 times your money. You spent $10 million total. That one winner paid you back $100 million. The 9 that failed? They were already priced into your model. They weren't losses. They were the cost of admission. This is exactly how Peter Thiel, the co-founder of PayPal, invested an early $500,000 into Facebook. That stake eventually became worth over $1 billion. One bet, massive asymmetric return. It's how Sequoia Capital invested $250,000 into Google in 1999. That investment is now worth, by some estimates, over $6 billion. The key insight here isn't that these investors were lucky. It's that they sized their bets deliberately. They never put so much into any single bet that losing it would damage the overall portfolio. And they truly accepted, that most of their bets would fail. Now here's the real-world version that matters for people who aren't deploying millions. This mindset applies to career decisions, to side businesses, to investments in index funds versus individual stocks, to learning new skills. The question you should be asking yourself is not, what if this fails? The question should be, if I make 10 small bets like this, what does it cost me if 9 fail, and what do I gain if 1 succeeds? Most people never take the bet at all. They overprotect their current position. And in doing so, they guarantee the outcome they're most afraid of, staying exactly where they are. Do you think the billionaires who built massive companies were less afraid than you? They weren't. They just developed a mathematical relationship with failure that made fear irrelevant. That's the venture mindset. And you don't need $1 billion to apply it. I want to ask you something. What is your time worth per hour right now? Not emotionally. Mathematically. If you took your annual income and divided it by the number of hours you worked this year, what number do you get? For most people, it's somewhere between $20 and $100 per hour. Now, what are you currently spending your time doing that costs less than that number to outsource? This is what I call the billionaire time principle. And it's arguably the most underrated wealth strategy on this entire list. Warren Buffett famously guards his calendar with extraordinary discipline. Bill Gates used to practice think weeks, periods where he would retreat entirely from daily operations and spend uninterrupted time on high-level strategic thinking. Jeff Bezos has spoken publicly about protecting his mornings for deep work and making major decisions before 5 p.m. These aren't productivity hacks. They're asset allocation decisions. Here's the principle in plain terms. A billionaire's job is to make decisions worth billions of dollars. Every hour they spend on a task that could be delegated, answering routine emails, managing logistics, organizing their schedule, is an hour stolen from work that only they can do. So they outsource everything that falls below their hourly value threshold. Personal assistants, house managers, drivers, chefs, chief of staff positions, these aren't luxuries. They're investments in the time needed to operate at the highest level. Now here's how this applies to you, even if you're not anywhere near billionaire territory yet. Research from Harvard Business School found that executives who delegated more aggressively grew their business revenue by an average of 33% more than those who tried to do everything themselves. 33%. Just from letting go of tasks they shouldn't have been doing in the first place. What is one task in your week right now that you could pay someone else to do, and what would you do with that hour if you got it back? The tools exist today that didn't exist 20 years ago. Virtual assistants, freelance platforms, automation software. The cost of buying back your time has never been lower. The question is whether you're willing to stop treating your own time as infinite, because it isn't. Time is the one resource that no amount of money can actually create more of. Billionaires know this. They structure their entire lives around protecting it. And the moment you start treating your hours the way billionaires treat theirs, asking yourself constantly, is this the highest and best use of my time right now? Something shifts in the way you operate. Let's bring everything together. The billionaires who protect and multiply wealth across generations are not doing magic. They're following a set of principles that compound over time, just like interest compounds over time. Principle 1. They use legal tax structures, trusts, foundations, tax-advantaged accounts, to keep more of what they earn and pass it down without the government taking 40% at every generational transfer. Principle 2. They use debt as a tool, not to buy things that lose value, but to buy assets that appreciate, generate income, and build net worth. They borrow at low interest rates against rising assets and invest the difference. Principle 3. They think in portfolios, not single bets. They expect most experiments to fail and size those bets accordingly, knowing that one asymmetric winner can justify the entire portfolio. Principle 4. They buy back their time relentlessly. They outsource every task below their value threshold so their mental bandwidth is reserved exclusively for decisions that only they can make. Now, none of this is magic. None of this is exclusive to people who were born wealthy. The Rockefeller family famously lost most of their fortune in the first generation after John D. Rockefeller. It was the implementation of these exact principles, trusts, disciplined investment, portfolio thinking that rebuilt and preserved the family's wealth across the next century. And there are just as many stories of lottery winners, professional athletes, and inherited fortunes that evaporated within a decade because the money arrived without the system. The system is what matters. The money is just the tool. And here's the most important thing I want you to take from today. You don't need $1 billion to start applying these principles. You need a trust. There are affordable options for people starting with considerably less. You want to start using debt strategically? A mortgage on a rental property follows the exact same logic as borrowing against stock. You want the venture mindset? Start by putting a small, defined amount into higher risk opportunities. An amount you can afford to lose, and track the portfolio, not each individual bet. The gap between how the wealthy think about money and how the rest of us were taught to think about money is real. But it's closable. And the first step to closing it is understanding that saving money in a bank account, while inflation runs at 3 to 4% annually, is not a wealth-building strategy. It's a slow loss dressed up as safety. The truly wealthy understood this a long time ago. And now, So do you. If this video gave you even one idea that changes how you think about your money, please share it with one person in your life. Not because it helps this channel, though it does, but because this is information that genuinely changes outcomes. And someone in your circle needs to hear it. Drop a comment below and tell me, which of these 4 principles are you going to implement first? Tax efficiency, strategic debt, the venture mindset, or buying back your time? I read every comment. And if enough of you want a deep dive episode on any one of these 4 topics, I'll build it. See you in the next one.